Welcome to the Zoom Bible study. Thank you for taking the time to be a part of it. The Lenten season is a time of reflection, making positive changes in our lives, and renewing our connection with God. The Lenten season also prepares us for Easter. However, there's no Easter without the cross. So, to help us in our Lenten journey, this year's study will focus on Jesus' final week in Jerusalem. What happened in that final week of Jesus' life that led to the crucifixion and ultimately the resurrection? And what Lenten lessons can we learn from a study of those events? As Amy Jill Levine has written, reliving the final days of Jesus during the season of Lent, we have the opportunity to think about our life alongside the life of Jesus, inviting inward transformation and then outward action. Now, due to the brevity of this study and that some of the days will be covered in upcoming Holy Week worship services, we'll primarily be looking at Monday through Thursday using the Gospel of Mark. Last week, we looked at the events on that Tuesday. It was a day filled with debate and confrontations between Jesus and various Jewish groups, ending with Jesus sharing the little apocalypse with his disciples. That lesson and other past Bible studies can be found on the church's YouTube channel, SOTC Huntsville. That's one word, SOTC Huntsville. That's the church's YouTube channel. Now, compared to the other days in that first Holy Week, Wednesday was the least active, but that does not make it less important. What happened on that Wednesday is wonderful, and it helps to set the stage for the events that were just around the corner. Once again, we have a Markian sandwich. If you recall from previous lesson, the gospel writer likes to begin one story, then tell a different story, and then go back and conclude the first. So story one is the bread, story two is the meat, and then story three is the other piece of bread. And when Mark gives us one of his sandwiches, he wants us to interpret the two stories together. So that's what we'll do. So on to Wednesday we go. Mark's Wednesday is found in Mark chapter 14, 1 through 11. And here's the first piece of bread. It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of the unleavened bread. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. For they said, "Not during the festival, or the people may riot." Here comes the meat of the sandwich. While Jesus was in Bethany, reclining at the table of the house of Simon the leper, a woman entered carrying an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard. And she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. But some were there who said to one another in anger, "What is the point of this extravagant waste? For this ointment could have been sold for over 300 silver pieces and the money given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you criticize her? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body and is preparing it for burial. The truth is, wherever the good news is proclaimed throughout the world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her. And now here comes the last piece of bread. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests to hand Jesus over to them. Hearing what he had to say, they were greatly pleased and promised to give him money. Then Judas started looking for an opportune moment to betray him. Now, surrounding the story of the anointing of Jesus is the plot to arrest him. After Jesus' demonstration at the temple on that Monday, the temple authorities were determined to get Jesus, but because he was so popular with the people, they knew that they had to do it by stealth. They could not risk arresting Jesus at the temple. If there was an outbreak of violence, Rome would get them all. As Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan write, chapter 14, verse 2 leaves us hanging for the arrival of Judas, the stealthy one, in chapter 14, verse 10. But then Mark begins to tell us another story about an unnamed woman who did something very loving, very intimate, and very prophetic. Mark and Matthew tell this story in the same way. The woman is unnamed, and it takes place in the house of Simon the leper. The Gospel of John tells the story, but names the woman as Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. All three Gospels place the story in Bethany and around the same timeline. To me, theologically speaking, it doesn't matter who and in whose house it takes place. What matters is what happens. Now, some of you may recall that Luke has a similar story, and he does. Luke has a story about a woman anointing Jesus' feet with a costly ointment, but it's a totally different story with a different timeline and a different lesson attached to it. Luke's story also takes place in the Galilee area earlier in Jesus' ministry. Now, since the gospel reading for this upcoming Sunday is John's version of the anointing of Jesus, I'll do my best to keep it to Mark's version. Now, the main purpose of that Markian sandwich is to contrast the failure of the disciples versus the belief and true discipleship of the unnamed woman. Throughout Mark, the disciples are portrayed as dull and never catching on to what Jesus is all about until after the resurrection. For instance, in Mark 6, we're told that the disciples' hearts were hardened. In Mark 8, Jesus asked mockingly, "You have eyes, why can't you see? You have ears, why can't you hear?" And on his final journey to Jerusalem, Jesus tells the disciples 3 times that the Messiah must suffer, be rejected, be crucified, but will rise on the 3rd day. And all 3 times, the disciples misunderstand. Even when Peter correctly proclaims Jesus as the Messiah, he misunderstands the job description of what the Messiah was to do, and Jesus had to rebuke him. And now, when Judas is brought into the picture as the soon-to-be betrayer in Mark chapter 14, Mark makes sure we know that Judas was one of the 12. Now, compare all of that to what this unnamed woman does. First, in the Old Testament, kings were anointed. So when this woman anoints Jesus with this costly perfume or ointment, it was a prophetic recognition of Jesus's kingship and messiahship. It was an extravagant act of worship and devotion. And by using this expensive perfume to anoint Jesus's body for his impending death and burial, the woman shows she actually understood what type of Messiah Jesus really was and showed her full commitment to that mission. In contrast to the disciples, she gets who Jesus is. Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, in their classic book, The Last Week, What the Gospels Really Teach About Jesus' Final Days in Jerusalem, writes the following summation. Against the continuous criticism of the 12, the significance of her action becomes clear. She has done what she could, says Jesus. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. And then they write, she alone, of all those who heard Jesus's 3 prophecies of his death and resurrection, believed him and drew the obvious conclusion. And they get into her head here. Since, not if, you're going to die and rise, I must anoint you now beforehand, because I will never have a chance to do it afterwards. And then Borg and Crossan write, she is for Mark the first believer. She is for us the first Christian. And she believed from the word of Jesus before any discovery of the empty tomb. And on top of all that, this woman is a model leader. Instead of jockeying for position and power like the disciples do, this woman is humble and has a servant's heart. What a model of discipleship. Now, does this mean that to be disciples of Jesus that we need to do exactly what she did? No, but it does mean that, like her, we need to do what we can. When the disciples criticized the act as wasteful because the money could have been used for the poor, Jesus defends her by saying she did what she could. She was 100% in. And isn't that what the Lenten season calls us to do? To do what we can. When we give ourselves to God without restraint, God will take our lives and reshape us by God's abundant and extravagant love. And our lives will always be enriched and more fulfilling when we make the choices this woman made. And to the disciples' criticism that the costly perfume could have been sold and used to help the poor, it is typical whataboutism, which is a debate tactic to deflect. We see it all the time today, right? No one who has read the Gospels could ever make the argument that Jesus wasn't about taking care of the poor. That would be silly. This in our text, this is a special moment, a once in history moment. And I like Amy Jill Levine's reflection on this. And so to close our lesson, I'll share her reflection with you. Jesus, like his fellow Jews, would, of course, have expected people to help support the poor. But in this case, there is the need to support him. Following his allusion to Deuteronomy, he continues, "But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial." We give our resources in generosity, even if they may seem wasteful. Bringing flowers to a friend in the hospital could be seen as a waste. The flowers are just going to die. And there are poor people who could have used the money spent on the roses or the vase. But at that time and in that place, the flowers can brighten the spirit of the one who is suffering. A few years ago, a good friend of mine bought me a massage. I didn't ask for it. I thought it was indulgent. I had an article to finish. But she told me the money had already been spent and that even if I did not want to go for me, I should go for her. So I went. It was one of the best things I have ever done. On that day, at that time, she knew what I needed even more than I knew myself. Her generosity revived me. We need to care for our friends and to do good things for them. The point is not to buy a bottle of Chanel every week. It is to know when and where and with what. And now, with Judas making a deal to hand Jesus over, the scene is set. It's about to go down. Next week, we'll look at what happened next. Until then, God's abundant grace and peace.